So Ivan, let's look a little more at the book of Joshua. How is the book structured? How is it set up? How does that help us understand what the message of the book is?
One of the most helpful things you can do with a book, especially the historical books, to read them, is to, first of all, understand their structure. They're all structured in a particular way, and when you understand that, you can read it intelligently along the way the author might have intended. Now, sometimes the structure, there may be several different ways in which you can structure, and good commentaries and good books on modern authors will do that for you. So you have to read these books along with some helps, and so good commentaries will be useful in this. You can outline Joshua actually in two ways, according to its themes and according to its literary structure. If you were to outline it according to its themes, there would be three parts to the book of Joshua. Part one would be God's faithfulness to Israel, and that would be chapters 1 to 21. And then that section will end with a summary statement. And so you have a summary statement that's part 2, 21, 43 to 45, summary statement. And then the third part of Joshua will be Israel's faithfulness to God. And that is chapters 22 to 24. So very simple structure. God's faithfulness to Israel in keeping his covenant promise to give Abraham the land, or to give Abraham's descendants the land. And so that's what the first 21 chapters are all about, of how Joshua took the land and gave it to the people in a covenant relationship for them. And they took it through the help and mercy of God. Then you have a summary statement which summarizes that part of the program, and I'll read that summary out. This is 21, 43 to 45. So the Lord gave Israel all the land he had sworn to give to their ancestors, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their ancestors. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hands. Not one of the Lord's good promises to the house of Israel failed. Everyone was fulfilled. Great summary statement. Then, in the rest of it, in 22 to 24, we now move to Israel's faithfulness to God. And this understanding of the structure in this way gives a very important theological wash over the whole thing. And that is, taking the land is one thing, but how do you keep the land? How do you hang on to it? Well, in order to hang on to it, the way it's also by faith. You take the land by faith in God's promises, with God's help, but you also keep it by faith and being covenantally obedient to God's covenant. And so that's what happens in the second part, 22 to 24. Joshua calls the people to covenant renewal. He pledges them to keep the law of God and the law of Moses, and tells them that if you do this and if you keep this, then you will remain long in the land. So obtaining the land is a theologically loaded thing. It is not just go and keep the land and you'll keep it by a great military, you'll keep it by techniques and so forth, by politically. You have to have faith in God to keep it as well. So that's outlining it according to themes. You can also outline it according to
Can I just ask a quick question?
Sure.
So do you have any thoughts on why, like the first part, God's faithfulness to Israel, has a summary?
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on why? Is there a summary for the second part?
There is it ends on a high note.
Okay.
And you can look at that in Joshua chapter 24. And it ends... After these things, Joshua the son of Nun, the son of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him there, and so forth. And verse 31, Israel served the Lord throughout the lifetime of Joshua and of the elders who outlived him and who had experienced everything the Lord had done for Israel. And Joseph's bones, which the Israelites had bought up from Egypt, were buried at Shechem in the tract of land that Jacob bought for 100 pieces of silver from the so on and so forth. And Eleazar, son of Aaron, died and was buried at Gibeah, which had been allotted to his son Phinehas in the hill country of Ephraim. So what is interesting, it actually ends on 3 funerals.
Yeah, you
know.
said it was a high note, and then 3 people died.
Joshua, Joseph's bones are buried, and Eleazar, the priest, the descendant of Aaron. But it's actually extremely positive.
Okay.
And that is this. All of these 3 people started when there was no land, when the land promise had not been fulfilled. Joseph died outside of the land, but he asked his brothers and his descendants, show me this favor, don't leave me buried here, but take my bones with you. I know that the Lord is going to give you the land and whatnot one day, and when he does, take my bones, don't leave them here in Egypt. I don't want to be here, I want to be in the promised land. Joshua, of course, was born outside the promised land, and so was Eleazar, born outside the promised land. Isn't it amazing that all of these people are now buried in the promised land? And that's the whole point. That's the high point. They might have died, but the Lord has kept his promise.
And it's where they're buried. That's the real message.
Where they're buried is the real message.
Okay.
They're buried in the promised land. So outlining it in terms of his literary structure, very simple. 1 to 11, chapters 1 to 11, taking the land. Chapters 13 to 21, allotting the land, dividing the land and allotting it. Sorry, chapters 1 to 12, taking the land. Chapter 12 is actually an epilogue to that section.
What's an epilogue?
It's a sort of a summary to that section. Allotting the land, 13 to 21, and then keeping the land, 21 to 24. Once again, keeping it, the only way to keep the land is through covenant faithfulness. You don't experience covenant promises without covenant faithfulness. And the land is one of the big covenant promises that God has given Israel. And a big lesson being taught by these narratives is, if you want to keep covenant promises, if you want to enjoy covenant promises, then keep your covenant. If you want to enjoy covenant blessings, keep the covenant promises. And Israel, of course, breaks that, and so they lose the covenant blessings. So in Joshua, taking the land, and they take the land in the first 11 chapters through 3 powerful military strikes. The central campaign, as soon as they come across the Jordan from the east side into the west, they deal with 2 major cities, Jericho and Ai, and that's the central campaign. And then there's a northern campaign of cities getting together to get Joshua, and the southern campaign, and that's how they take the whole land. But then what happens is, once they have the land, they have to allot the land. And the allotting of the land is very interesting. Because you will read in Joshua contradictory statements. We read the summary, and it says they took all the land, and the land had rest, and so on and so forth. It's really, there are other parts of Joshua, for example, that will say that Joshua did not take all the land. There was yet much land that was left to be taken. So this is one of those other places where the source critics love to point out contradictions, and there were many sources and so forth. But actually, they misunderstand the taking of the land. What Joshua did with his army was fight the major battles, the 3 major battles that needed to be fought to break the backbone of the Canaanites. After those 3 battles, the outcome of the war was won. But there were still little battles to be fought. The major Canaanite backbone was broken, and henceforth the land ethnically was transferred from Canaanites into Israel. So what Joshua then did was, he didn't go and fight every little corner, every battle in every little corner. He divided up the land according to lots, as the Lord had shown him. And then it was up to each tribe that received that part of the land to go in and using the same faith and example that Joshua and his army showed, in the same faith, go and take their little corner of the land. But that is where the plan broke down. Joshua did his part, and he took the major portions. But when he allotted it, the tribes, they were a mixed bag. Judah did well, and Judah immediately joins up with Simeon, the 2 of them, and a little bit with Benjamin, and they go take the land. They have some great heroes, Caleb and so forth. But after that, the plan falls apart. Dan fails, Naphtali fails, Asher fails, and they complain about how it's too difficult and all this kind of stuff, and the whole thing falls apart because the tribes do not show individual faith in the plan. So anyway, that's the taking the land and allotting the land. That's what it was that's the way it was supposed to be, and then keeping the land, as we mentioned, 21 to 20, 22 to 24. That's that.
So can I ask a question about taking the land? And we're going to maybe revisit something we discussed earlier, and that's the archaeological evidence for great battles, and how perhaps some critics have concluded, there's a lack of evidence for these kinds of great battles. Therefore, and they'll leap from their observations to a conclusion about how maybe we can't really trust what the record is saying. How should we look at the evidence, or how might we resolve that?
Right. Yes, the archaeological evidence for a massive sort of blitzkrieg of the Israelites into the thing is missing. And there are two problems. That's one of the ones. We can't seem to find a complete devastation of all these cities at the same period of excavation. You can excavate at different levels, right? As you excavate down, you move back in history. So, for example, and I'm being totally cartoonish here, let's say 100 feet below might be the 1300 level. You go another 100 feet, you're going to find the, what would we say, we're going backwards in time, so it would be the 1400 level, and so on and so forth. So the Joshua timeline is, there are two. The reason why this question is complicated is because it's related to a whole bunch of other uncertainties. For example, the date of the Exodus there are two dates that are archaeologically posited for the Exodus, and that is one in the 1200s and one in the 1400s. And so you can see that's quite a bit of variation there, depending on how you date the system. And the city that has had the most interesting attention is, of course, Jericho. And if you come with me to Israel, when we go there, we will actually do visit Jericho, which is considered the oldest city in the world. And one archaeologist figured that they had actually found the destruction of Jericho at the right time of Joshua. But then a British archaeologist named Kathleen Kenyon came along, and she actually said, no, that was wrong. It should be, I can't remember now whether it was before or after, but it was not during the time of Joshua. And so the timeline shifted. And then the other city that only shows some sort of a big, massive invasion is a city called Hatzor in the northern part. But then, so how do we reconcile this? Well, one thing to keep in mind is, in archaeology, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. That's very important. Just because we haven't found the evidence does not mean it didn't happen. Who knows? We are still carrying out these digs and these explorations. We might find it in the next 10 years. We might find it in the next 20 years. There's so much left yet to be uncovered. And because of lack of money and resources, we cannot dig. If you read carefully, then that's the first thing. The second thing is, if you read carefully the books of Joshua, it is really only Jericho and Hatzor that they completely and totally destroyed. And we hear that he actually burnt down Hatzor. And Jericho, of course, fell down very, very, very dramatically. The other ones, we are not really told how badly the damage was done. So we can't really count on the fact that we do not have a whole massive slash and burn evidence to support that. So we have to adjust it that way. There are a whole bunch of other things, but I think maybe that's enough on that topic.
Yeah.
Unless you want to explore something else.
No, I think that's very helpful. So it shows us that it's still an open question.
Open question.
And I thought it was interesting how you drew us back to the Exodus, because if we're still, I mean, the Bible doesn't tell us when the Exodus happened, so we have to, it doesn't give us a date.
No.
So we have to kind of figure that out ourselves, which is maybe not that easy. So if, getting where that happened is going to determine when Joshua took down Jericho. So, finding where are we in the stratum when we're doing archaeology can be a bit of a challenge.
Can be a bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
The dating that we use is in, where is it now? I believe it's in 1 Kings, I don't don't know if I can find it just off the top of my head. It is where we are told that Solomon built the temple. I believe it is 960 years after the Exodus.
Okay.
But the problem there is, okay, so you go 960 years. We can date pretty much when the temple was built because
Okay.
there are other records from other cultures that we can, sorry, not 960 years, what am I talking about? We can date the building of the temple to 960, and I believe he says 400 years after the exile.
Okay.
But the problem with that is the Exodus itself gives you two different datings for when it could have happened in the beginning of Exodus. So you can't tie it down to a particular date. You can't work back from the 400 years and get to 1400 or 1200. It's a pretty complicated question. All right, so that is the issue about archaeology and the structure of Joshua.